Good. Well, I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I was not going to argue when they decided to ground the flight last night while the airport was under a tornado watch. So I wanted to share with you today some thoughts about how the established field of conservation biology might interact with the emerging field of de-extinction. And there are some characteristics that these two fields share that are promising. Probably the one that's most notable is that they're both synthetic fields that bring people together from a variety of different disciplines to work together on a common purpose. For conservation biologists, their main goals are documenting the biological diversity on our planet, understanding how human beings impact species and communities and ecosystems, developing practical approaches to prevent species extinction, and finally, protecting and restoring biological communities and their associated functions. It's those last two areas of conservation biology's goals where I think the most fruitful intersections with de-extinction will occur. It's an intersection to be sure, but it's an intersection that could involve either conflict or cooperation. For conservation biology's focus on species, they have used three main tools to ensure a future for species on the planet. Protecting species from direct harm from human beings is obviously a paramount goal. For species that we utilize as natural resources, we can conserve them and use them in a sustainable way so that we don't drive them to extinction. And finally, for species that have been badly damaged by human activities, we can restore them to a viable state. It appears that we're about to add a fourth leg to this stool. And if you know anything about building a stool, you know that a stool with three legs is very easy to balance. It's not really all that important how long the legs are. It'll always be fairly stable. But when you add a fourth leg, the stool can become tippy, and there is the possibility for the need to get these very carefully balanced if the stool is going to be stable. So I want to speak first about some of the ways that the revival of species, the de-extinction of species, could actually interact with conservation biology in a negative sort of way. And indeed, de-extinction has the potential to undermine some of conservation biology's efforts to prevent extinctions. We know that conservation biologists have always struggled, as have climate scientists, to convince the public and decision makers and policy makers that the extinction crisis is really a calamitous event that we need to avoid. And it is entirely possible that de-extinction could undermine the efforts to view the extinction crisis as a calamitous event. And even worse, de-extinction could provide those that often harm biodiversity, harm species, to have an easy out by saying that, well, we'll do what we need to now. We can always bring them back later using de-extinction technologies. Both of those would undermine the efforts of conservation biologists. There's also the potential for de-extinction to conflict with efforts to prevent extinctions. And this could easily happen when you were reviving long extinct species that could potentially become invasive or indeed threaten extant species or communities. And I put the emphasis there on long extinct because when a species has been gone for a long period of time, the community that it was once part of readjusts and comes to a new equilibrium often that could be upset by the reintroduction of this long extinct species. It's also possible that a conflict could arise if you revive a long extinct species for which current environmental conditions seem unsuitable. In other words, where you would really have an uphill battle to try to keep the species viable. That could certainly make the species very heavily conservation dependent. It would require a lot of work to keep it going, and that could provide conflict and competition with efforts to prevent species from going extinct. On the other hand, there are some positive aspects of de-extinction for preventing extinctions. Some of the technologies that are being developed as part of the de-extinction effort could actually help prevent extinctions of some critically endangered species. We know that many critically endangered species have passed through severe population bottlenecks, and they've lost much of their genetic diversity, which makes their future uncertain. Some of the technologies of de-extinction could help by actually restoring some of the extinct alleles that these species have lost by retrieving them from museum specimens and other sources. Species like Mauritius kestrel and black-footed ferret are examples of species that are genetically depauperate that could actually be helped by genetic engineering techniques. De-extinction technologies could also help prevent extinctions in the instances that do happen when an endangered species has been so reduced to perhaps a few individuals, or in some cases even a single individual, that natural reproduction is no longer possible. In cases like that, certainly cloning might provide a potential solution for keeping the species going. It's also possible for some endangered species that have proven to be either difficult or impossible to breed in captivity using conventional approaches to actually use some of the technologies that are being developed as part of the de-extinction movement to make reproduction of these species a possibility. So these are all very positive aspects of the contributions that the emerging field of de-extinction could provide to conservation biology's efforts to prevent extinctions. The other area of overlap and intersection is the question of restoring community integrity. And certainly, de-extinction could help restore community integrity when you're dealing with the revival of a very recently extinct species that had specific threats that we've now overcome. In cases like that, it's less likely that the reintroduction of such a species back into its community would have a disruptive effect, and indeed could still have a very positive effect without disturbing the other members of the community. And we certainly have lots of examples, unfortunately, of species that have gone extinct quite recently and for which a revival could, now that we've overcome their specific threats, pave the way for putting them back into the community that they were once part of. The Argyll woodpecker and the thylacine are just two examples. Similarly, helping to restore community integrity could be a real aid to conservation biology when we have now secured suitable habitat for a species that's recently gone extinct. Species like the quagga and the Caribbean monk seal are examples of species that went extinct, but since their extinction, we've made tremendous strides in terms of protecting their environments, their habitats, so that they might once again fit in very comfortably into areas that have now been put under conservation management. So the final way that de-extinction technologies could help restoring community integrity has to do with very specific members of a community. Restoring keystone species or very highly co-evolved members of a community could almost always have a very positive effect on the other surviving members of that community. Particularly, we're looking at instances in which there are important interactions between an extinct species and surviving species. Animals and the sort of anachronistic seeds, as they're called, where a plant has lost a pollinator or seed disperser, like the case of the dodo and the tambalacock tree on the island of Mauritius. Bringing back the extinct species could have substantial benefits for the other members of the community. And of course, we're all very well aware of some of the recent efforts by conservation biologists to put keystone species like top predators back into ecosystems like Yellowstone, where they have a tremendously beneficial impact on the health of that ecosystem. The main thing here is, again, the emphasis on recently extinct species, where their niche is still there, where the niche could provide benefits for other members of the community rather than providing a threat to them. So turning on to de-extinction as a field, although it's an emerging field and the goals of de-extinction are still a little fuzzy, my attempt at describing some of the short-term goals for de-extinction are shown here. Obviously, recovering DNA from extinct species and sequencing the genome of an extinct species are one of the first steps. If they can recover DNA that's in good quality, it's possible that we could clone individuals, which would obviously be the most direct and fastest way to accomplish de-extinction, as has already been done with the case of the Picardo. However, as the case is almost always going to be, the recovered DNA is going to be badly degraded, and we're going to have to use some genetic engineering techniques, which lead to the possibility of creating a new individual that is not exactly the extinct species, but perhaps closely approximates it. The issue then becomes, once the lab work is done, that certainly everyone's hope for de-extinction is that a population of the revived species might in fact be created, and that population might eventually be returned to its natural habitat. That certainly is a long ways off, but it certainly, I think, is the endpoint that most people who are enthusiastic about de-extinction see as the ultimate goal. Well, that last point, restoring populations of revived species, that is the point at which conservation biologists will play a very big role in the eventual success of the de-extinction process. If an extinct species is actually revived in the laboratory, conservation biologists are then going to play an increasingly important role in what happens next. To start off with, conservation biologists should certainly have a seat at the table in selecting the best candidates for revival, especially picking species that are going to have the best potential for successful restoration into the wild, and specifically picking candidates that are likely to avoid those conflicts that I described earlier. If that actually happens, and the process is underway, certainly conservation biologists have lots of experience, unfortunately have lots of experience with recovering populations from a very small number of founders. We've done this in a number of cases quite successfully through captive breeding and reintroductions. We also have an increasing level of sophistication and understanding about how to restore ecosystems through reintroducing keystone and co-evolved species. And indeed, in the case of some recently extinct species that might be the best candidates for de-extinction, conservation biologists may have even had some experience trying to save the species before its recent extinction. So these are areas of tremendous opportunity for conservation biologists to join with the de-extinction field and help it achieve its goals. Will this collaboration actually flourish? It's one thing to talk about it, and another thing to actually make it happen. I think already the conservation biology community is quite certain that its primary goal, its priority, has to remain securing the future for the tens of millions of extant species, many of which are severely endangered. Over 10,000 species are threatened and endangered. And in light of that, bringing back a few select species from extinction seems like a dramatic side story when we are struggling to prevent these huge losses of species. Nonetheless, as you can tell from my presentation, conservation biology and de-extinction efforts have tremendous potential for working together to ensure that their respective goals are both compatible and mutually supportive. Thanks. So I gather from the applause that worked out okay from your end.
Yes, it did, Stanley. Thank you. For most of our panels, we're having each of the panelists speak and then taking questions. Because I think we only have Stan until 2 o'clock. Why don't we take questions for Stan right now, let him get off the phone, and then we'll have the follow-up presentations by Kate and Jamie, and questions following them. So if there are any questions for Stanley Temple right now, would be a good time to raise them.
And someone is going to have to speak closely in the phone because I can barely hear what's going on in the background.
I got a question. Stan, Stewart Brand.
Can you hear Stewart, Stan?
Yes, go ahead.
I was interested to see you putting keystone and co-evolved species as something conservationists can help know about and help reestablish. Do you have examples of co-evolved species that we would like back? I guess your dodo story relates to that.
Well, there are lots of examples, and of course, one of the frustrating things about these examples of coevolution that sometimes results in mutualism is that you don't often know about them until one of the partners is gone. These can be rather tricky to unravel, and we suspect that there are many more than we already know about, which has always been one of the justifications for not allowing species to go extinct, because of this sort of law of unintended consequences that the extinction of one species might indeed set up a cascading extinction of other species. But the examples of keystone species and co-evolved species, we think of top predators as being the sort of featured keystone species that have been in the limelight recently, but there are certainly many others. Co-evolved species, we immediately think of plants and their animal partners, pollinators, seed dispersers, and so forth. I noticed there was just a feature article in Science magazine this week demonstrating how important the coevolution between seed-dispersing birds in the tropical forests of Brazil and the future of some of those plant species that depended on them can be. They've already shown that even after just a few generations of having the seed-dispersing animals being absent from the community, that they've already seen not only immediate demographic effects on some of these plant species, but they've also been able to detect distinct genetic changes in response to the lack of that partner. So lots of possibilities there, Stewart.
Yes. Hi, Stan. It's Terry Root. How are you doing? Can you
that one, you're going to have to speak up. I can barely hear you.
Okay. Stan, it's Terry Root.
Hi, Terry.
How are you doing? Something that I'm concerned about, and I've talked with Stuart Pym and also with Paul Ehrlich, and everyone seems to be quite concerned about the fact that if it gets out that we can actually bring extinct species back, then we're not going to have to worry about having extinct species go extinct at all, and we're going to lose the Endangered Species Act, things like that. Can you speak directly to that for me?
Well, that was one of my earlier slides, of course, and yes, it is an extremely important consideration. All of us who have worked on trying to prevent extinctions of species know that when you're confronted with someone who is somehow inconvenienced by the need to recover an endangered species, that they will try every trick in the book to try to get the species out of the way. Can't we breed them in captivity? Can't we capture them and move them somewhere else? Can't we mitigate for the loss of habitat by creating habitat somewhere else? And certainly de-extinction adds to that list, perhaps becomes the most potent of the of the options that people can use to argue that we should be able to go ahead and damage species. So yes, that is certainly the central concern that I have heard from conservation biologists, and one that is going to be very hard to deal with once the genie is out of the bottle.
Hi, my name is Liza Gross. I'm a science journalist, and I wanted to follow up on that concern of conservation biologists with another one, which is in an era of scarce and dwindling resources. Are you concerned about the diversion of funds for bringing back species that are gone when are so few funds and dwindling every day to conserve what we have?
I'm really having trouble hearing you.
So the question, Stan, if I can paraphrase it, was a question about similar to Terry's concern, but particularly regarding limited resources. I assume you mean sort of resources for conservation, the diversion of funds for de-extinction rather than other conservation strategies.
Well, honestly, I am not as concerned, and I think many others are not as concerned about the monetary part of this. I think the money that's going to be available for de-extinction efforts, at least in the laboratory, are going to come from very different sources. It's not a zero-sum game, as we've learned repeatedly. However, we're not just talking about money. We're talking about other resources as well. And as I mentioned earlier, if a species is revived and is reintroduced back into the wild, it then becomes an additional, perhaps very high-profile burden, if you will, on conservation biologists to look after that species and help it along. And that certainly, given the limited resources that are available for preventing species extinctions, that could be a really important source of competition.
You have another question?
Hi. Hi, my name is Clara. I have a question. With regard to having conservation biologists help decide which species are good candidates for de-extinction technology, how do you see any conflicts or comments on how we were going to address places with very high biodiversity and also who are very threatened? I'm just thinking Madagascar or any other type islands like that.
Can you repeat that question for me?
Yeah, so for areas...
Somebody who's closer to the telephone or to the mic, please, because I'm really having trouble hearing these distant voices.
So I'm not sure I understood.
Why don't you come up?
Yeah, that's probably best. Yeah.
Where should I stand?
Right, the speaker's right there, so just you can stand.
Okay. Hi, I have a question. For areas with high biodiversity, how do conservation biologists pick which are good candidates? So I'm thinking Madagascar, which obviously has a lot of problems with maintaining its biodiversity, protecting it. Am I speaking to this?
Yeah, and the question then was what?
How do we address areas with high biodiversity? How do we decide which candidates or which species are good candidates for,
Okay, now I've got it. Yeah, well, some of you who may have seen the TEDx De-Extinction talks know that I actually made a proposal that we may need to invent a new discipline that I sort of tongue-in-cheek called resurrection biology. And resurrection biology would basically address these issues of which species and where they should go and where the priorities ought to be. And I think the next speaker is probably going to have some more to say about that specifically. But it's something that clearly all of this needs a lot of advanced planning, and that is something that we've just barely started. But it needs to be much more formalized when we start thinking about what indeed might be possible in the future.
Okay, we have one more question from Chuck Bonham.
Hey, Stanley, this is Chuck Bonham. I'm the director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I've watched your presentation, and I just saw this presentation. And in response to the last question, I hear you describing a way to pick. My question is, based on your career, who should pick?
Well, obviously, my career has been very focused on making hard choices about endangered species and recovery. And we often have to practice triage. There are species that have languished because we've decided for one reason or another that our scarce resources can be used in other places. But those are very tough decisions, and they are decisions that really ought to be discussed in the broadest possible forum before decisions are made. We have mechanisms, obviously, for doing that under the federal and state endangered species legislations, and I suspect at some point we're going to have a mechanism for public discussions of possible future revival and restoration of extinct species as well. I really don't know what form that will take, but it's obviously going to be an important, I would say, prelude to anything actually happening. One would hate to see major decisions made sort of in private without a lot of input, because as you're finding out at this conference, there are a lot of stakeholders, if you will, who have an opinion about what ought or ought not be done.
Thank you. Okay, definitely our last question, Stan, for you.
Hi, I would like to ask about the possibility of genetic engineering of endangered species.
Yes.
To introduce characteristics that are detrimental to human interests. For example, off the top of my head, I can think of elephant tusks that would crumble after the animal dies, or rhino horns that would make humans sterile, or depress libido, or shark fins that would sicken or poison soup eaters.
I love thinking about that. I'm not the person to ask about the technology of making that happen, but certainly we continue to be surprised at what genetic engineering can actually accomplish.
Could be some liability issues.
Sure.
I already asked about liability. They depend on precedent, and there is none yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm much more enthusiastic about the sort of positive aspect of reviving lost alleles than I am introducing sort of exotic alleles that might convey some survival value. We could worry about doing that perhaps after the species is in a fairly secure, viable state. But
Great. Well, thank you so much, Stan. So next we'll have Kate Jones and Jamie Clark. After they are done, we will take questions for them both together. Incidentally, it may be pretty obvious, given the titles of their talks, that a lot of the issues that were raised for Stan are certainly going to be covered by both of those speakers, and hopefully if you have further questions that want to go in depth more on those, certainly they will be able to engage those as well.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation to come to Stanford and to leave the UK, which has currently been raining for 3 months. So it's nice to have some blue sky. In fact, I posted a picture of blue sky on my Facebook page to show people in Britain what it was like. So I'm very grateful to be here. I was asked to come and talk to you about kind of setting priorities for de-extinction, and some of the topics which I'm going to be talking about have been raised earlier in a couple of other talks, like Beth's one about who should be de-extincted, if that's the right word, and Stanley's just touched on some of those things as well. So I think mine's very similar, but it's got pictures, so I hope I will entertain you. So I spent most of my career thinking about what makes species go extinct. So that's basically what I've spent my career doing. So having to think about how to make species unextinct is challenging and very interesting. So I'm trying to give you a kind of outline of some of the priorities, which species we should maximize to kind of give the best chance of de-extinction actually happening, and also what impacts that will have on the environment. So what are the knock-on effects of ecosystems would there be? So humans have been very efficient at killing species, making things extinct. So these are extinctions that have happened over the last 500 years, and with the iconic species that you know and we've talked about as well, dodo and the passenger pigeon, but also with species like the Steller sea cow, thylacine, and my own personal favourite, the short-tailed fruit bat of New Zealand, which kind of crawls around the ground, or did, and ate scorpions. So that's just a drop in the ocean of the things that we've made extinct. A paper recently that came out in PLOS Biology looked at the documented extinctions and undocumented extinctions in the Pacific in the Holocene, and came up with some statistics about 1,000 species that we've made extinct in that period. So out of all this mass extinction, which species are we going to pick to focus our efforts on? And can we avoid it being a bit tokenistic? Can it actually be useful for conservation? So perhaps the first thing to think about is the habitat that the species would go into and the threats that it was facing when it went extinct. As people have been talking about before, perhaps a good example or a candidate would be a species which has got habitat that it could go into in the North Atlantic, and the threats which were facing it, which was egg collecting, are now not present, so things like the great auk. So maybe that's a good example, but a really bad example would be the Chinese river dolphin, that its habitat has been polluted and its habitat's getting worse, not better. So this isn't an official documented extinction, but the last one was seen in 2004. It takes a while to get through the system. Another thing to think about is population size and behaviour. So having a viable, being able to make enough individuals to create a viable population size is going to be really important. So perhaps the passenger pigeon isn't a good candidate. I've talked about this before, Ben, isn't a good candidate because the viable population sizes might be quite large. Also, with Steller sea cow, for example, these things are enormous, like over 8 meters long. So gestation times are going to be absolutely massive, and it's going to be a long time before you get a population which is population size which is viable. And both species are very social, and bringing that kind of social behaviour back is very, very tricky, despite what Ben tells you. Sorry, Ben. Not picking on you. Another interesting idea is evolutionary history. The idea here is that there's something that's distinct about species, that species that have a long evolutionary history, which is distinct from other species, is unique, is something that we want to maintain, like a piece of fine art that's very distinctive. And so species which have got a long evolutionary, unique evolutionary history might be things that we want to consider conserving. And this is an example I have from my own work, putting together the phylogeny of all mammals. So this is in a nice circle, with the branch lengths there kind of graded by time, so there's a little scale at the top. So if I just focus in on one bit of that tree and just expand that, you can see that species A here has got a lot more unique evolutionary history than species B and C, which are very closely related. So it might be that losing species B would be much less of a big deal than losing species A, because you're losing much less unique evolutionary history that's gone on. So I'm sorry to tell you that the passenger pigeon, the auk, the mammoth, and the quagga would all be species B and C. Species like the thylacine and the short-tailed bat, of course, would be on species A, be more evolutionarily distinct. So these are things to think about when we're trying to start prioritizing species in a quantifiable way. One of the programs at ZSL where I work has come up with a program which focuses on the evolutionary distinctiveness of different species. And this kind of prioritizes species depending on their uniqueness. And this could be something which, that we could develop into a kind of priority setting list, and they even have a kind of barometer of how much conservation action each species has to kind of bring together conservation action and priority setting. So whatever happens with de-extinction, I think it's really critical to engage with the conservation community, as Chuck was saying earlier. The IUCN Red List has gone through the extant biodiversity as much as they can to give it a code of endangerment. So it goes from least concern on the left up to extinct in the wild and extinct. This is kind of a ladder of extinction, and perhaps we could use some of their priority setting, their kind of criteria and priority setting, to think about where extinct species could fit into there. So the IUCN categorizes species based on the number of extant individuals, the recent declines, and the threats that they're facing. So perhaps we could invert some of those characteristics and criteria to think about ways to look at the list of the list of species to prioritize those. But kind of bringing it back to why we should do this in the first place. I can't stand here and set priorities for de-extincting species without pointing out that we are facing one of the biggest challenges that our planet and we have ever faced. And so this is a graph from a recent paper in Science, which is showing you the status and trends of the world's biodiversity and our responses to that. So on the left, we've got the kind of state of biodiversity, and there are a number of indicators of biodiversity, numbers of species, or water quality index, or things like that. So they've kind of amalgamated those on the left-hand side. So the state is declining of biodiversity and quality of the environment on this planet. The pressures which are forcing those changes are increasing. So the number of humans on the planet, number of introduced species is increasing. Our responses, fortunately, are increasing in response to these impacts. And the benefits that we're getting from biodiversity, these ecosystem services, are declining. So this isn't supposed to be a depressing thing, but there's a context here which needs to be understood. And this is a really interesting graph that came across from a paper in Science a couple of years ago by a whole slew of people that looked at the rate of change of species on the red list. So this is the rate of change over time of species going up or down the red list categories. And so where you've got purple and black, that's where the rate has been the fastest, decreasing through those categories. So this ladder of extinction thing that I told you about, those species have gone up the ladder, off the edge. So these species are becoming much more endangered over time, and there are particular spatial characteristics and patterns of those threats. And this is for amphibians, mammals, and birds, and you can see that they've got different kind of trajectories in these different places. And the red lines just here mean what the effect of conservation has actually had, which is very little, fortunately. So perhaps the main point about de-extinction, and this is probably what I believe, is that the methods which are being developed for de-extinction could be used for reviving species on the brink of extinction. And so perhaps looking across different vertebrate groups here and invertebrate groups and plants, we could start moving some of the species which are in these black, red, and orange bars and the yellow bars into green bars. So things like, one of my personal favourite things ever is the kakapo, which is this enormous green parrot which lives in New Zealand. It's got 126 individuals. They know all their names, which is very funny. The enormous giant salamander. These are amazing things that we don't want to see go extinct. And of course, the Javan rhino with under 40 individuals are key candidates for me for these methods to bring these back from the brink. So you asked me what my priorities are, it would be those. So, although I do like thylacines. So I just want to end with this idea that perhaps we're not thinking about this quite right, and that de-extinction is just the very tip of the iceberg in our discussions of how synthetic biology, the manipulation of DNA in organisms, can actually interact with conservation biology. So perhaps this is just the start, just a start of our understanding of how synthetic biology can interact with conservation biology. For example, I'm a bat biologist really, so that's why you keep seeing lots of bats on the screen. These species in North America are crashing. They're crashing. And perhaps we could use synthetic biology techniques to manipulate these species to not be so susceptible to white nose syndrome, or to alter the pathogen so that it's not as pathogenic. So I guess there are signs that the conservation community is starting to have these conversations with the synthetic biology world. And one of the reasons is this paper that came out in PLOS in a couple of months ago, looking about how the guidelines in the CBD conference, how they could be solved, or the key elements in the convention could be achieved with synthetic biology, which is I think this is a really cool paper, and it's really eye-opening and forward-thinking. And I think it lays down a challenge to conservation biologists to actually start interacting with synthetic biology in a kind of informed and calm and collected manner without grandstanding. So that's what I think is this world vision is. We're entering a time on our planet where things are changing, not just in the next, there's a kind of version of what we've got now, completely changing. So we might have these organisms which fake trees to clean out the carbon in our atmosphere, or regenerate diseases or pathogens not to be pathogenic. These are things that are going to change the ecosystems on our planet, and I think we need to be prepared much more to deal with that and to deal with the impacts on conservation and our ecosystems. Thank you very much.
I'm afraid to touch anything here. I think it's right. Is that it?
Yeah, I think that's it.
I was afraid to blow it up.
Which is it? This one?
I think it is.
Okay. Just hit that corner. It would work. Oh, because this computer is being.
Hang on 1 second.
Oh, he's doing that. You don't. I don't want to show you slideshow.
These lawyers use a take to make a PowerPoint work.
There's only
The
two.
answer is we don't know. Never been done.
It's still connected to her computer, so we get switched.
And I couldn't repeat Kate's talk.
No, we'll get it. No, it's on this computer. So we need it. This isn't my law school. So.
It's too high tech.
confirmed something Kate said very quickly that I just confirmed with her, that New Zealand bat she was talking about was a flightless bat. The idea of a flightless bat seems
And then, so this must be
odd.
then, huh?
I can see why you would want to insert. I can also see why you would need.
It's like,
How do you make it good?
yours is actually. Okay, I'll call.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, I'm happy to start while we're trying to get settled here. First, thank you, Hank and Alex, for inviting me to this conversation. I have to admit, I think I've probably changed my remarks about 6 times today already, so I'm a little unsettled as I go into this. But and apologies to Alex, who actually invited me to this, and in clear biological fashion, I exhibited displacement behavior for quite some time before I answered him. Not because I didn't think this is amazing and fascinating, it's because I was somewhere between, there's just no way I can have a conversation about this because I'm so kind of unsettled and conflicted, and there's no way I can miss this conversation. So I, of course, in a kind of collegial way, and Defenders of Wildlife is directly across the street from National Geographic, so we couldn't avoid the vibrations of the conversation that was happening. And I happened to be out of town that day, but some of my colleagues went and were all excited about it. So of course I sit with all of our biologists and lawyers and policy people and discuss whether I should go, and they said, oh, you've got to go. And I said, what should I say? And they said, I don't know, but say something. So off we go. My task is, and I'll admit at the outset that I am a wildlife ecologist who has spent a career kind of working in a political world and practicing law without a license. So apologies to the Stanford Law School. And I am going to be talking a little bit about the ecological and political risks. And big thanks to Chuck and Stan Temple, who preceded, because they've taken a little bit of pressure off of me. And like Chuck, to some degree, maybe a lot of my comments are easier shared through storytelling. So I want to talk a little bit about the political realities and risks of de-extinction, but I can't decouple that from the conservation and ecological risks. So maybe starting with the notion that's been discussed this morning of some of the early stages of creating a few individuals in a lab and offering some thoughts on what I think are some of the probable profound political, social, and cultural outcomes, if you will, of endangered species conservation. But my epiphany that I've been having today, after listening to the lawyers and some of the afternoon and discussions, and really amplified by Stewart's discussion at lunch, is that I have to believe, after a career working with the Endangered Species Act and working on endangered species conservation, that I'm not sure this is an ESA thing at all. And so I'll try to kind of capture my thoughts as we go through that. Make sure I have that working. Okay, let's do that. So, as a biologist, I thought my first story, I want to talk a little bit about sperm. So on your left is what a normal endangered Florida panther sperm is supposed to look like. But on your right is what it looks like when something goes horribly wrong. And when I was in the Fish and Wildlife Service heading up the Endangered Species Program, that's what I was faced with. The population of Florida panthers in the southern Florida system was down to a very few individuals in the wild, and the decision about what to do sat on my shoulders. We had three, I remember sitting with the then director of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Secretary of the Interior thinking, okay, what are our options? Typical crisis management in the Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government. One is do nothing. That seemed a little rude because we had the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, and what were we going to say about that? If all of a sudden we had a critter that was no longer inside the refuge. Two was the California condor road, pull them all in and capture what was left and try to actively manage the genetics for potential reintroduction. Or three was, okay, we're really at the edge and we need to augment the gene pool with related cats of the same species. And that's indeed what we did. We airlifted, brought in 9 cats, related species from Texas, and the Florida panther, albeit slowly, is on its way to recovery today. I was at the Fish and Wildlife Service when all 3 of the species that you see on the screen, the Mexican gray wolf, the Florida panther I just talked about, and the California condor were hovering at the very brink of extinction. In fact, frankly, all 3 of them are still in pretty tough shape today. Life or death discussions, life or death challenges, facing the future of their long-term sustainability, serious biological risk. We were forced to figure out how to government-like certainty. So here we were dealing with incredible uncertainty, incredible biological risk, how to stretch the heck out of our conservation laws to give us the air cover to move forward, and realizing that we needed a lot of political courage, which in Washington, D.C. is seriously lacking these days. So my perspective going forward in the discussion today is maybe a little bit different than you've heard, in that so much of what we've done over the last number of years in endangered species is compelled by crisis. And I think that is an incredibly important way to think about decision making when you're dealing with government bureaucracies, certainly on the federal side. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is a fairly complex agency. You heard some about their statutory authorities: the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Lacey Act. They manage over 500 and something refuges, numerous fish hatcheries, field offices all over the country, 9,000 employees. It is a different presentation of what Chuck shared this morning in the state, but nonetheless, lots of authorities and lots of complexities. So process and policy don't always facilitate the decisions that need to get made. But crisis does indeed bring out the best in people, especially in a federal agency. So when we were at the brink of having to make a decision on the Florida panther, we were backed up at the door and we had to go somewhere. That not doing something was not an option. And so a lot of the issues and a lot of the, you've heard this morning, or this afternoon, a lot of the challenges associated with de-extinction, I can tell you firsthand that if the outcome or the evolution of this issue takes the edge off or takes the urgency out of preventing extinction, it will become a shunt for non-action or no action, and I believe that very, very clearly, because what will happen is there will be an opportunity to say, if we can hold on to that DNA, we don't have to rush to judgment. Or, what's really great in government, let's go create a blue ribbon panel and think about it for a few years. Or, let's commission a National Academy study and really study it for a while. Meanwhile, Rome is burning. And so already when we're dealing with endangered species, we're too late. Almost every species that I have seen come onto the list in my entire career has been listed too late. We wait until we're right backed up against the wall. So if the prospect of reviving species makes the problem worse or the challenge worse, it could be a concern. So let's go to politics. I'm just picking two of my favorites. Former Congressman Richard Pombo on your left. Thank you, California, for taking him home. And now a lobbyist, but long time working on undermining and destroying the Endangered Species Act. And on the right, current Senator Jim Inhofe, who's ranking minority on Senate Environment and Public Works. Unfortunately, these two aren't alone. This is the reality of today's Congress. Many members of Congress are against any effort to protect and restore species, especially if it runs into economic costs, imposition on private lands, or the operation of private companies on public lands. So just in the last month, we spent a lot of time at Defenders trying to defend today's law in an increasingly declining champion world. We've staved off amendments to delist the polar bear, amendments to disallow endangered species protections for species that occur within state boundaries alone. That's over 600 of today's listed species. And an amendment that declares that any aerial or satellite imagery being used to restore and recover endangered species is illegal. So my concern is by creating a release valve that tips the scales towards allowing habitat destruction now when the economy is tight in today's sequestration world in favor of restoring it someday when the economy is better is a bit of a challenge. In the mid-2000s, there was a big initiative to take the pressure off the Endangered Species Act by putting all the pressure on the zoos. And there was a huge rush in Congress to say, if we can save them in zoos, don't worry so much about it in the wild. We fought that for a very long time because the captive breeding and the restoration going on in the zoo environment is never a substitution for recovery in the wild. But again, the storage of DNA, the idea of species revival does have some real positives. So just budget, and I'm just trying to whip through this really quickly. The federal budget's not getting any better. Chuck mentioned the state budgets. Authorities, responsibilities, workloads going up, budgets going down. They're not keeping pace at all. So you see right there the federal dollars for recovery and consultation, inflation adjusted. It's not looking really pretty. The president this year proposed $10 million increase. 2 days ago, the sequestration, Congress came back telling the Interior Department to shave 5% more off of the 15% cut that the Fish and Wildlife Service has already taken in the FY14 budget. Budget's going down, 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 responsibilities going up. So while a lot of the conversation about de-extinction is talking about it being a private endeavor, it won't stay private for long because you're going to need the federal and state government, we'll need the federal and state government to back up this effort as it gets its legs. The notion that the idea of de-extinction will create excitement by the Congress and more money, not going to happen. Boy, I sound like Debbie Downer. Not going to happen because what will happen is it'll cause a shunt. Congress will say, do this, not this. It's not going to be additive in today's budget world. On a more positive note, actually what really excites me is that I think the idea of de-extinction effort is both exciting and inevitable, and we've heard that today. I just can't see the moral, the philosophical, the budgetary, the policy or cultural arguments from people like me slowing down or stopping something as cool as bringing back the passenger pigeon or the woolly mammoth. So I honestly get that. So we're going to have to figure out how to do this in a political world, and those of us working to try to balance law and policy. So let's do the flip side of the Florida Panther. What we've heard today and what the scientists are learning to do, I would have just given anything to have had a decade and a half ago. We should never, given what we're learning today, we really should never again lose critical genetic diversity from species. We should never have to deal with extreme population bottlenecks. We should be able to get ahead of those curves. You heard Stan talking about that. Keeping genetic diversity in banks, huge, huge. I call it re-diversifying or regening. Just make up words. But I think I see great promise and great need and least peril. So I'll give you a couple of examples before I sum up. Two species, the iwi Hawaiian bird that's disappeared from Oahu and is shrinking range rapidly. And it is absolutely on an extinction trajectory. Sage grouse, that is our spotted owl of this decade. And it's going to make the spotted owl look like a walk in the park. The grouse are declining quickly. Range is shrinking daily. Absolute heroic efforts between the federal and state and others to stave off the decline. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But the rush to prevent the endangered species listing is very, very real. Having an insurance policy for these two species would be incredibly beneficial. National effort to save these two through some of the genetic diversity opportunities, huge. So let me begin to summarize. When thinking about the ecological damage or benefits that revived species might cause, how far we go back is certainly of interest. Reintroducing large herbivores in the wild is something that'll cause huge ecological damage if we reintroduce them without reintroducing their predators. And I mean big predators if we're bringing back the woolly mammoth. So critters like the dire wolves, which are 25% bigger than today's wolves. Saber-toothed cats, certainly bigger still, and short-faced bears. As a former director of the Fish and Wildlife Service and now at Defenders of Wildlife, I can tell you it is a ginormous, that's my kid's word, but a ginormous lift just to get wolves back on the western landscape in this country. And so, let's not delude ourselves that this country is not prepared for the restoration of apex predators back onto the landscape. I mentioned ESA. I'm not sure that today's environmental laws were built with this kind of change in mind, but maybe they don't need to be. In fact, I'm beginning to, the Endangered Species Act is under such siege right now and is very wobbly in Congress right now that I would almost create a firewall for this so that it doesn't get hitched to the wagon of the Endangered Species Act. So to conclude, I have 4 conclusions. There is no doubt in my mind that politicians will take advantage of this technology. Not to fund it, but to undermine species conservation. I know that sounds negative, but I've been at this long enough to feel fairly strong in my conviction. Revived species are cool, and people will pay money to see them, but it won't translate into increased support for wildlife conservation of species that we need to save today. Second, agencies are incredibly challenged. You heard Chuck talk this morning. And California is literally one of, if not the best and most robust. So his colleagues nationwide don't enjoy near the support and capability that California does. They're already stretched to deal with crises. So the quick fix of DNA storage will make it harder for species to rise to the, for agencies to rise to the challenge of action in the face of extreme extinction risk, and we need to be quite careful about that. Third, ecological damage is in the eye of the beholder, and I've decided to accept that. So what is ecological damage to some is ecological benefits to others, and so I've kind of set that aside. And lastly, what I call functional rewilding. If we're focusing on restoring herbivores and not carnivores, we shouldn't call it conservation. It's a future zoological park, or it's something that folks can visit and look at. But to rewild, maybe it's because I've spent so long working on apex predators, we absolutely need to confront the balance of carnivores being part of that conservation. If we're restoring recently extinct species, I say, bring it on. But today's conservation laws, particularly the Endangered Species Act, I believe creates kind of significant and perhaps insurmountable challenges to doing so, whether it's distinct population segment, whether it's the definition of species, whether it's the notion of hybrids, whether it's how we implement today's law. And given the status of today's Endangered Species Act flanked by the state's laws, that's not a risk I feel comfortable taking because I think that the day we lose the Federal Endangered Species Act will be a sad day for biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
All right, we'll take questions.
Question. This is for Jamie. Ryan Phelan, Executive Director of Revive and Restore. I have great respect for all the work that you've done and really appreciate hearing your perspective today. I would love to hear you address a little bit more about an idea that you had. You sort of put a placeholder up there about creating a firewall between de-extinction efforts and ESA, and would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just kind of have made that up today, honestly, because I came here thinking about, especially in talking with Alex, how to fit rewilding or de-extinction into the Endangered Species Act. And I found myself through the morning thinking, well, why do we have to, frankly? And I'm reminded of a couple of examples. I can remember clearly the agony of trying to provide Endangered Species Act protection to the Alabama sturgeon. And I was fighting with the White House and the Secretary's office because I couldn't prove it existed. But we knew it was out there. And until we actually captured one in the river, the ESA wouldn't apply. So now we'll reverse it and say, okay, so we want to bring something back. Because our de-extinction, I'm now convinced, isn't going to replicate what we lost specifically, then you're going to be subject to the huge fight that's gone on for decades over hybridization. Do you really have what you lost? And does it really meet the definition of species? And we worked for years on what a distinct population segment means, and I don't think this is it. And so why burden, if you will, the Endangered Species Act, which has as its purposes to provide a program for the conservation of threatened and endangered species and to protect the ecosystems they depend on, with the de-extinction. I don't know what it gets us in this effort, and I don't think it's necessary. But I'd have to think more about it because people want to use the Endangered Species Act to compel an action, but I am terribly worried about the future of the Endangered Species Act, and I'd almost rather separate them and try to travel the road of de-extinction in kind of a science world without policy. Besides the other legal things that, but I don't think it's an ESA thing.
Hi there. So, there's a number of members of Congress, and now and then we get a president who, for lack of a better description, are anti-science. And I think with respect to that, I'm wondering what, I guess both of you, Jamie from the perspective here in the United States and Kate from what's going on in Europe, whether or not you think that people who would be against de-extinction efforts from just kind of a general, quote, anti-science perspective, whether you think that they will, in fact, hitch de-extinction to the Endangered Species Act to list some of the animals that people want to bring back on the endangered species list as an effort to prevent people bringing them back, whether you think that that's a salient possibility to the extent that listing is a political decision, at least here in the United States. I mean, Kate, I don't know whether or not listing has the same kind of political persuasion there.
That's kind of an interesting reverse psychology, actually. I think that it is incredibly troubling for the last decade or so how science has been tortured in the federal decision-making world. But to a large degree, the decision on whether or not to list a species has been protected by the cocoon of science. And that's why there's so many legal challenges to a decision not to list or list, because the science arguments fall apart and it's fairly transparent in the legal debates. I'm not sure that I see it being used in the way that you presented it. I'm more concerned about it being used as an off-ramp to deny protection for an endangered species. I think somebody said it earlier. Will you ever really have extinction? And if the definition of endangered is in danger of being threatened or in danger of becoming extinct, and you can't prove it because you can de-extinct it, then I could see some incredible shenanigans with that concept.
I think that in Europe, we're not so litigious. We don't have this listing or not listing. We've got legislation, Habitat Directive legislation, which protects species. So there's not one particular species that makes it on or makes it off. So it's not so controversial about what species make it onto this list or don't. And so that without this kind of target, you don't get this attacks. So it's kind of legislation which is the target in a way. It's not one species or another. We have exactly the same problems with governments across Europe feeling the pinch, wanting to cut back, not being interested in the Habitats Directive because of economic pressures. So we've got exactly the same things, but we don't have this list that people attack.
And one of the reasons for that is really striking, because having worked with Canada on their laws in the past, the United States Endangered Species Act is so volatile because of the regulatory side of it. And there's no other Endangered Species Act that has the regulatory prohibitions, so that listing comes with it kind of legal ramifications that aren't as visible in other kind of endangered. So the precursors to the 73 law were lists, and nobody cares. Nobody really cared because it was just it was like a listing, you know. It was, but the minute regulatory authority came with it and enforcement mechanisms, it became very volatile.
And that is happening in Europe now with the Habitats Directive. People are being prevented from building and being prevented from, you have to put mitigation in if you're going to do something. And so now we get the kickback on, conservation organisations saying that they're against bats, for example, in buildings because they're all protected. So you have to stop work if that happens. So that would never happen in the States.
Question here. Boy, I think you're right on the political reality bullet point, Jamie, that even the remote possibility of de-extinction hadn't been proved yet, the editing version, but the remote possibility of it can be used by the Senator Inhofes of the world to say, well, screw it, just let them go extinct and something wonderful will happen later, and it's not on my watch. On my watch it can go extinct and no one cares. There'll be more money later and more science later, and it's a real risk. So then, politically, what does one do to head that off? So there you are, you're testifying to Senator Inhofe's committee, and he says that very thing. What do you say back?
Vote right, Oklahoma. That's one. Well, I do think, it is. We're at a very interesting time, and I'm conflicted here because we're in the 40th anniversary year of the passage of the law, and it's now, I think we are recycling what I believe is a very important values or argument in this country. It's not an issue of science. We can document species decline, and we know the critters that really do require protection. But it's what we say as a society about our obligation to prevent extinction, and how a healthy environment and a healthy economy are flip sides of the same coin. We've lost that argument inside the Beltway of Washington, D.C., and so bringing that movement back in this country through either grassroots or the science community, who's been so helpful in this, is incredibly important. What I say, I'm kind of filibustering here. What I would say to a Senator Inhofe is that bringing something back that we can't guarantee, and the newness of this experimentation is absolutely not a substitute for saving what we have. It's a bit of the same argument that we had when we had to fight off the zoos versus habitat conservation.
Well, that's interesting.
And it really, you have to kind of debunk, which is what made me, Stewart, listening to your conversation and others this morning, think to myself, maybe we're better off not burdening the Endangered Species Act in a way that could put it at greater risk. Because I don't know that it's necessary.
You know, I'll bet there's some terminology from medicine of prevention versus cure. The low cost of prevention, in this case extinction, and the enormous cost and risk of cure of extinction.
Bruce Babbitt, Secretary of the Interior Babbitt, during my time in the Interior Department, absolutely, that was his mantra. And what we used to always talk about is the cost and efficiency of conservation is orders of magnitude more robust than the cost of restoration. I mean, look what it's taken for gray wolves. Look who is, I mean, that's a huge part of this.
I'm curious whether, speaking biologically or taxonomically, it makes sense to talk about this project being reviving or bringing back species, and whether a specimen that's created through backbreeding or genetic modification or even through cloning is taxonomically considered a member of past extinct species, given the genomic differences between the two.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that this is a point which will become more and more important, because with genetic modified organisms, what are they and where do they fit? And I think that is going to be a really interesting debate to have in the next few years, the next decade or so. I think we're going to see a complete change in the taxonomy on the planet because we'll have all these new organisms that we won't know where to put.
Or how to characterize, and therefore how to provide, extend legal protection or not. This will be a huge issue for taxonomists because we're already dealing with it in today's taxonomy with what we currently have.
So I'm not sure whether I've got a question buried in here, but I've got a couple of comments I'd be interested in hearing Jamie's response to, plus a comment for Kate. The comment for Kate is, although I love my country and I am a patriotic American, be very thankful that you are not an American right now living with our political system. And with that lead in to Jamie, and three things. I mean, I do think that today's, I hope for all sorts of reasons, that today's Congress is a low point in American governance, because if it isn't, if this kind of deadlock goes on for much longer, and you know, in a sense, I almost don't care which way it gets resolved, but although I do, but if this deadlock goes on for much longer, we've got far bigger problems even than the Endangered Species Act. But two things I'd like your thoughts on. One is, do you think there is a chance, I think there is a chance, that de-extinction could help catalyze a grassroots movement? I can imagine lots and lots of people, especially kids, but younger people, getting excited, contributing their pennies, their dimes, their $10 bills, etc., for de-extinction in a way that could be really useful to rebuild a political, to build or rebuild a political movement in ways that might be useful. And then second, and I feel bad about this because I'm, you know, in a sense, over the last year and a half, I've been partially responsible. Maybe the cat is out of the bag in terms of the bad side of this, and the worst outcome would be de-extinction gets talked about enough, so that politicians say we don't have to do anything about endangered species because we can de-extinct them, and yet we don't actually do the science to be able to de-extinct them, which would be the worst, I think, of all possible worlds. So thoughts on either of those?
I do think, and that's really what compelled me here, the coolness of it all. And as a biologist, I want to believe it can happen. But I don't know what the it is, Really? And so, because I've been confined to working within the frame of law for most of my career, I don't sense that the Endangered Species Act will do a good job of accommodating this experimentation at this moment in time. Just because of definitional issues. And if there's a soft underbelly, it will be taken politically. So the kids and others that think it's cool and bringing back something. Remember all the excitement when somebody, Cornell thought that they got an image of the ivory bill on record, and it was like mass, exodus moving to the swamps of Arkansas, and the amount of money spent by the Interior Department, earmarked by the Congress to see it again for 5 years was unbelievable, and it really did distract from all the other issues of native biodiversity in the Southeast. So people want to believe they can bring it back and right or wrong, whether it's moral or scientific or ethical reasons. So I get all that. But I think we need to condition that with a lot of conversation that we haven't really done it yet. So don't give up on what we have because we haven't figured this part out yet. And so what you don't want is two ships passing in the night in different directions. And the importance, I can't emphasize enough, I know I sound like a broken record, but if Congress has already stepped in once with the gray wolf, first time in 40 years, they declared something recovered. Congress has no business making science decisions. And you can best believe if they think they have a way in today's economic climate to assuage their own guilt over this, they'll do it. The conversation. Oh, all over the place. I know it's a huge challenge for the states, in the science community, the voice. Balancing the application of science in a political world is a very challenging conversation. Because science for science sake is nice, but it's that balancing of science, law, and policy, which Hank and Alex have brought this group together to do, is intensely important right now. So it's one thing to say we can do it. It's another thing to say, so how do we hold on to it? And what's the role of this initiative? But that voice is, we have a president that he's got a few things on his mind and a couple of things to do. And I have never seen in my career in government or even in the nonprofit world now an executive branch less attuned to conservation issues. Honestly, and that just pains me to say that, but it's just not really there. The ones that require tough regulatory choices.
So, quick comment, and then I have a question. For what to say to the senator, I think something interesting to point out would be, so if you have an aunt in the hospital who needs medical care, you have option 1, pay her medical bills and see if she gets better, or option 2, let her die, then bring her back and try to, pay her medical bills after the fact. I think that's a pretty good way to talk to the congressman about it. But just a quick question, Kate, about something you said earlier. You had species A, B, and C on the board. And you said that species A is something that we should target because it has a greater genetic diversity, or is more unique than other species. And at first glance, I think that makes a lot of sense, but I was wondering if there's a correlation between the genetic uniqueness of a species and the uniqueness of its resource profile or its environment, and if those species are in fact more difficult to save than, say, other less unique species, and if that's something that we should be focusing on as well.
I think I said could, not should.
Right.
The problem with those species is, I agree with you, and the problem with those species as well, as Beth was saying, is that they haven't got a close analogue, so you can't clone them. They're really hard. The thylacine is almost impossible, I would say, because the closest thing is a Tasmanian devil. So, I think that's a very interesting empirical question that we don't know what the answer is, to be honest. But I think there are significant difficulties in bringing those species back.
at the moment.
So I have a question that's for Kate and Jamie, but also kind of in an unorthodox way, Stewart, involves you. And it's really, I think, for me, a reflection that my thoughts are forming even as we're having this discussion. And it's purposefully polarized to spark a discussion, not to suggest a formed opinion on my part. So I can't figure out yet whether the conservation prevention of extinction side of the house and the de-extinction revival side of the house will reach a pivot and choice point. So your question to Jamie about how she might respond to the good senator is a question I would redirect backwards and say, those who may currently be proposing revival, is there an anticipation that the risk of revival to the prevention of extinction may be so great you won't push forward as you are now? I mean, I ask because I'm trying to sort through whether we, in fact, different sides of the same house, will find ourselves in conflict or reconciliation towards some greater comprehensive good. And I don't know if Kate or Jamie, you have a thought there?
Ryan's dying to say something. I'm going to step in and say something here because we are not, the people who are here are not the only people that are working on reviving extinct species. There are people in Australia, for example, like Dr. Mike Archer, who is so bullish on it that he will do anything to bring them back. So, as Hank said, the cat is out of the bag. There are people and organizations that are going to work on this no matter what. I think everyone who I've ever talked with that is involved in this feels very strongly that the message will always be that it is much better and essential that we preserve and protect that which we have, and that we cannot ever let that go. So in a way, your question is like, it's like asking an oncologist or a physician to say, you know, will you ever just accept that a cure for cancer is enough and we're going to cure people and never prevent it? And that the people who are working on cures for cancer don't care about prevention. It is so diametrically opposed when it's raised like that, but everyone who practices medicine cares about prevention. So, you know, I really, you know, I feel that it's so polarizing, and it can't be for the people that are working on it. So they're going forward, no matter what.
And I didn't acknowledge those purposes.
Yeah, exactly. I might flank that and meet up with Ryan from a different perspective. As I've thought more and more about this, I think where I sit now at Defenders of Wildlife, or if I was back in the Fish and Wildlife Service, this kind of exciting endeavor would not change my priorities at all. It wouldn't change what contribution Defenders of Wildlife or the Fish and Wildlife Service, our statutory authorities, or our conservation mandates. I think the real critical issue, point well taken, it's out of the bag, so that train is moving. The important issue here, to your point, which I thoroughly agree with, is there can be no degree of separation between us. Because if there is, they'll drive a train through it. So that's what's important. It is all about messaging. It's all about perception. And we have to kind of figure this out as we go forward. Absolutely.
And if I might add, I think, as I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Right. You know, this is just de-extinction because you guys are passionate about it and we're here talking about it. But the bigger issue, I think, is synthetic biology and conservation and how those two interact. And we need to figure this out because I think it's going to explode. I think, you know, if you look at all of the business models, it's synthetic biology, which is going to change the world, it's going to solve the problems, it's going to be massive. And how is that going to impact us? And we need to think about how to work with that.
I just can't resist the most cynical response to Ryan's nice example about oncologists. No oncologist would say that, but tobacco company executives would.
They're not trying to cure cancer.
But there may be tobacco company executives or their equivalents in Congress.
Last question over here.
My question refers to something Jim said early in your presentation, and you mentioned that you've had to stretch current policies sometimes. In what ways are you stretching current policies? And the second follow-up question to that would be, what small, maybe achievable additions can we make to our current policies, perhaps within the next 5-10 years, we can actually achieve will make your job easier?
Well, in kind of my schizophrenic career, the Florida Panther example was one that was incredibly high risk. When we stretched the Endangered Species Act to accommodate the introduction of 9, they were Felis concolor, but they weren't Felis concolor corii, which was the endangered Florida panther, but the Texas cats in to augment the gene pool to give the Florida panthers. And I remember being dragged up to the hill saying, well, what have you done? Do you have Florida panthers or panthers in Florida? And I kept saying, does it matter? You know, the Florida panther, that thing is incredibly important to the integrity of that system. So that's one way. I think the Endangered Species Act is, I think somebody this morning called it malleable. It really is, because it's such a common sense law, but we need to be careful. And when you get into the areas of kind of taxonomy and definition of species and distinct population segment and all that, we just have to be careful about the slippery slope. And what I will say, which is incredibly dicey right now, is that science has got to matter. And it's when the political decision makers start using science to justify an outcome they already want, we're in trouble. I always used to say it's fine if the science is here and the political decision makers want to go a different direction. Well, then own it. Don't blame it on science. And so it's just how we kind of navigate that that's really important. But I do think in my current role at Defenders, you know, we're spending a lot of time working really hard to restore native biodiversity in North America. And I think one challenge that I had not predicted when I worked to release the wolves in Yellowstone and the Mexican gray wolves in the desert, the alpine of Arizona, was I was so naive, and we just did not calculate the social intolerance to predators. And so that we have a huge challenge if we want to restore these predators that are so important to restoring native biological diversity and ecosystem health, we have to figure out ways to increase social tolerance and reduce the conflict. And that, I think, is our biggest challenge, especially west of the Mississippi.
So we'll continue some of this conversation in the plenary later on. But for now, let's thank our panelists.